Welcome, dear friends, to Family Shadows, a place where we bring you stories that are not only dramatic but deeply human. Here, we talk about fathers, mothers, children, and the invisible threads that tie generations together. If family means something to you, if you believe every father's sacrifice, every mother's love, every child's struggle carries lessons worth remembering, then I invite you to stay with us. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing to our channel. That way you'll never miss the next story that might just remind you of your own life. Tonight's story carries both tenderness and heartbreak. It's about a father who thought he was invited to share a meal, but discovered something far more painful instead. Tonight's story is titled, "My Daughter Said Dinner Was Canceled, but I Found Them Eating Without Me." David Harris was 62 years old, though he sometimes felt older when the mornings grew stiff in his bones. His late wife, Margaret, used to tease him that he had a carpenter's back, bent from decades of sanding wood, lifting beams, and building homes for people who'd long forgotten to send thank-you notes. But Margaret had been gone for 12 years now. Since then, the house had grown quieter, the dinners lonelier, and the weekends longer than they should have been. Yet there was one thing that kept him holding on: his children. Emma, his eldest, was 34 now. Sharp, ambitious, living in a world of polished suits and quick decisions. Then there was Mark, 2 years younger, quieter, steadier, the kind of man who followed the currents rather than made them. Both of them had families of their own, dinners of their own, busy schedules of their own. Still, every so often they called him over. A Sunday roast, a midweek lasagna, a birthday barbecue. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind David that he wasn't completely forgotten. That Thursday evening, David had just finished polishing an old photograph frame when his phone buzzed. It was Emma. For a moment, his chest lifted. A dinner invite always lit his week like a porch light on a dark street. He wiped his hands on his faded work jeans and opened the message. "Dad, dinner's off tonight. Something came up. We'll reschedule soon." David stared at the glowing words, "Dinner's off. Something came up. We'll reschedule." He read it twice, 3 times. A part of him sank, not in anger, but in that quiet ache known only to parents who realize their children's lives now spin without them at the center. He set the phone down, rubbing his temples. He had already bought a bottle of red wine that morning. It was a habit of his, bringing a little something for the table. His late wife used to say, "Never walk into family dinner with empty hands." It was her way of teaching gratitude, of keeping the circle unbroken. But now, as the evening shadows stretched across the living room, the bottle looked unnecessary, like a wrapped gift left behind at a canceled birthday party. Still, something tugged at him, a thought he couldn't silence. What if he just went anyway? Maybe Emma had been stressed. Maybe she hadn't meant to cancel so abruptly. Maybe Mark would be there. Maybe Sophie, his little granddaughter, would ask about the toy boat he was carving for her. He couldn't quite let go of the hope, so David put on his brown jacket, the one Margaret had patched years ago, and slipped the bottle of wine into a paper bag. The night was cool as he walked down his porch steps, locked the door, and drove the short stretch into town. When he pulled up to Emma's house, the driveway was crowded. 2 cars, Emma's and Mark's, were parked neatly, and laughter drifted faintly through the windows. David frowned. "Canceled," she had said. He walked slowly up the path, his boots crunching against gravel. The porch light was on. Through the curtains he could see the faint silhouettes of people moving, plates being set down, arms reaching for glasses. He pressed his lips together, knocking gently. The laughter inside dimmed, replaced by a shuffle of chairs. The door opened. It was Emma. "Oh, Dad." Her voice carried a startled tremor. I told you dinner was off tonight." Behind her, David caught sight of the dining room. A table gleamed with roast chicken, bowls of mashed potatoes, and a salad dish Emma's husband used to call her signature. Around the table sat Mark, Olivia, and little Sophie, who waved absent-mindedly before Olivia pulled her back down. The sight pierced him, not in the chest but deeper, in a place that fathers don't quite have words for. He held up the wine bottle. "Thought maybe I could just drop this off." Emma stepped aside awkwardly, her face painted with guilt. "It's just Dad tonight it wasn't planned for you. We thought you'd be tired." Tired. The word fell heavy, like a brick laid between them. David nodded slowly. He didn't argue, he didn't scold. He simply placed the bottle on the entryway table, patted Sophie's head as she peeked curiously from her chair, and turned back toward the door. The laughter did not follow him this time. Only silence. The night air clung to David as he walked back to his truck, the paper bag lighter now without the weight of wine. He set his hand against the steering wheel, fingers drumming softly before finally turning the key. The engine rumbled awake, but inside the silence was louder. He drove with the window cracked, letting the cool breeze brush against his cheek. Street lamps flickered by like slow-moving fireflies, casting brief glows that vanished just as quickly. Each glow reminded him of something. Emma as a little girl, holding his hand on the way back from school. Mark sitting on his shoulders at a county fair. Margaret humming softly in the passenger seat, tapping the dashboard in rhythm to whatever song was on the radio. Tonight, the seat beside him was empty. The wine bottle was gone, and so, it seemed, was the space he once held in his children's lives. But David wasn't a man of anger. He wasn't the kind to slam doors or demand explanations. Life had taught him that bitterness was a slow poison, and he'd seen too many good men drink from it until it hollowed them out. He carried his hurt differently, quietly, inward, as if it were a stone in his pocket. You didn't throw it at anyone. You just carried it day after day until maybe one day it wore smooth. When he got home, he set his jacket on the back of the chair, lowered himself into the seat, and listened to the ticking of the kitchen clock. It was nearly 8:00 p.m., prime dinner time at Emma's. They were likely still laughing, passing plates around. Maybe Sophie was already asking for dessert. David pulled out a drawer by the sink, retrieving two things: an old photo album and a folded sheet of paper. The album had worn corners, its spine taped together twice. He flipped it open, tracing his fingers over the glossy images. Margaret in her garden, smiling with soil on her palms. Emma on her first day of school, gap-toothed grin. Mark in his baseball uniform, holding up a glove bigger than his head. The pictures spoke like ghosts that never aged, even as he had. Then he unfolded the paper. It was Sophie's drawing, crayon lines scribbled into the shape of a boat. She had given it to him a few weeks earlier. "Grandpa, when will it be finished?" She had asked, eyes wide, her little hand tugging his sleeve. He had laughed, promising soon, and it would be soon. The half-carved boat sat in his shed, waiting. He had been shaping it from pine wood, sanding the edges smooth, carving initials into the stern, S.H., for Sophie Harris. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. The memory of Sophie's excitement gave him warmth where the evening had given him cold. He imagined her face when he would finally hand it to her. That thought kept him steady. The truth was, David lived for moments like those. He didn't need grand gestures from his children or constant calls or fancy words. What he needed was presence, small tokens that reminded him he still mattered. But tonight he hadn't mattered, at least not enough. Still, he clung to hope. Perhaps Emma's message had been careless, not cruel. Perhaps Mark had gone along with it without question. Perhaps Sophie had asked, "Where's Grandpa?" but been hushed with a quick excuse. Yes, maybe it was all just misunderstanding. He told himself he would call Emma tomorrow, not to argue, not to accuse, just to ask when they might gather again, all of them, because a father's love bends far longer than it breaks. David rose from the chair, slipped Sophie's drawing back into the drawer, and went to the shed. The air smelled of cedar shavings and old varnish. He ran his palm along the little boat, still rough along the bow. With a slow exhale, he began to sand it back and forth, the rasping sound filling the night. Each stroke was a prayer of sorts, a reminder of what he could still give. Outside, the town was quiet. Inside, the memory of family dinners lingered. And though tonight's table had been full without him, David clung to the hope that one day his seat would not always be left empty. 2 nights later, David found himself driving again. The small boat for Sophie was nearly finished, its smooth edges polished until they gleamed under the dim light of his shed. He had even painted a thin stripe of blue across the hull, a detail Margaret would have insisted on. "Every boat needs a horizon," she used to say. That evening, he wrapped the toy carefully in newspaper, placed it inside an old shoebox, and tied it with twine. He told himself he wasn't going over uninvited. He was simply delivering a gift to his granddaughter. Gifts, after all, didn't need a calendar. As he pulled into Emma's Street, the sun had already set, leaving behind an amber trail fading into gray. Porch lights glowed in the neighborhood, families settling in for their nightly rituals. David parked across from Emma's driveway, holding the shoebox steady in his lap for a moment before stepping out. From the sidewalk, he heard it first. Laughter. Not the polite kind, but the hearty, belly-deep kind that comes from shared stories and easy company. It rolled through the slightly open window of Emma's dining room. He paused, his fingers tightening around the twine. He stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel, and the sound became clearer. The clinking of forks, the scrape of chairs, Mark's unmistakable chuckle, Sophie's high voice asking for more mashed potatoes. David's chest hollowed. He reached the window, and through a narrow gap in the curtains, he saw them. The table glowed under the chandelier, plates spread wide with roast chicken, vegetables glistening with butter, a pitcher of iced tea sweating against the tablecloth. Emma sat at the head, laughing at something Olivia had said. Mark leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, grinning, and Sophie, sweet Sophie, had her hair tied up in pigtails, swinging her legs under the chair, giggling as she tried to scoop gravy without spilling. And then he saw it. The empty chair. It wasn't tucked away, nor was it forgotten in a corner. It was right there on the side of the table where he always sat. The plate was missing, the silverware absent, but the chair was there, waiting, empty. David's hand pressed against the window frame as though to steady himself. He wanted to believe it was all a mistake, that they had simply forgotten to tell him plans had changed, that the cancellation had been genuine. But the truth was spread across that table, steaming, fragrant, alive with chatter. The truth was they had chosen to eat without him. He backed away, his heart thudding. He didn't knock. He didn't call. He didn't want Sophie to rush into his arms and expose the lie. Instead, he set the shoebox gently on the porch, just beside the doormat where Emma would find it later. He lingered for a moment, brushing his palm over the twine one last time, as if saying goodbye not to the gift, but to something deeper, the illusion that he still belonged at their table. When he turned, the laughter inside swelled again, muffled by the walls but sharp enough to pierce him. He walked back to his truck, slower this time, shoulders heavy as though each step carried more than just his body. He didn't start the engine right away. He sat there staring through the windshield, watching the light glow from Emma's windows. Inside, his family ate. Outside, he remained a shadow. The shoebox sat forgotten on the porch, a silent offering from a father who no longer had a seat. The next morning, Emma opened the front door to let the dog out. She nearly tripped on the shoebox. "What on earth?" she murmured, bending down. The twine was rough, knotted carefully, the newspaper wrapping slightly smudged from travel. She untied it, peeled back the paper, and froze. Inside lay the little wooden boat, painted with a soft stripe of blue. On the stern, carved with gentle precision, were the initials S. H. Sophie's initials. Emma's heart tightened, though she couldn't quite tell if it was guilt or annoyance that pressed harder. She glanced over her shoulder. Sophie was still at the table finishing her cereal, her legs swinging beneath the chair. Mark was scrolling through his phone and Olivia was packing her work bag. "Mom, what's that?" Sophie asked, her voice bright. Emma forced a smile and carried the box inside. "It's just something Grandpa dropped off." Sophie slid off her chair and rushed over, eyes sparkling as she lifted the boat with both hands. "Grandpa made this. I told him I wanted one." She hugged it to her chest, beaming as if she had just been given the world. Emma's throat tightened again. For a brief moment, she saw her father's weathered hands shaping the wood, heard his steady voice telling stories while he worked. She remembered being Sophie's age, watching him in the shed, believing he could build anything. But then Olivia's voice cut through. "Well, isn't that sweet?" she said dryly, slipping her purse strap over her shoulder. "But Emma, you really need to talk to him. He can't just drop by like that. It's awkward." Mark looked up, shifting uneasily. "Liv," he muttered, but Olivia waved it off. "No, I mean it. He shows up, sees us eating, and leaves a gift like some kind of, I don't know, ghost at the window. That's not normal. He needs to respect boundaries." Emma's stomach churned. She hadn't told Olivia about the message she'd sent her father, that she had canceled the dinner. She hadn't confessed that they had chosen to eat without him, so she nodded quickly, too quickly. "You're right, I'll talk to him." Later that evening, she dialed his number. David answered on the second ring, his voice calm as always. "Hi, Dad, Emma." He sounded neither surprised nor cold, just steady. "I found the boat on the porch. Sophie loved it. She hasn't put it down all day." David allowed himself a small smile in the quiet of his kitchen. "That's good. I'm glad." There was a pause. Emma bit her lip, searching for words that might excuse what she had done without admitting it. Finally, she said, "Dad, about the other night, we thought you might be tired. You've been working in the shed so much, and, well, sometimes we figure it's better not to bother you." Her words felt thin, like paper stretched too far. On the other end, David listened. He didn't argue. He didn't call her a liar, though both of them knew the truth. He simply said, "I see." Emma swallowed hard. The silence pressed down on her until she added quickly, "We'll make it up to you soon, okay? Maybe next week. I'll let you know." "Of course," David replied softly, "whenever you're ready." When the call ended, Emma sat at the table, her hands trembling slightly. She told herself she had smoothed things over, that her father had accepted her excuse. But deep down, she knew she had planted something she couldn't take back, a fracture in the trust that once held them close. And on the other side of town, David hung up the phone, staring at the small calendar pinned to his fridge. The squares were mostly empty, save for doctor's appointments and grocery reminders. He marked a small X over the day, then set the pen down. In the quiet of his kitchen, the chair across from him remained empty, waiting just like the one at Emma's table. The following Sunday, Emma sent another message. "Dinner at 6, come if you'd like." There was no apology in the words, no warmth, but David accepted them anyway. A father will take even crumbs when the memory of a feast is gone. He dressed neatly, buttoning the blue shirt Margaret once said brought out the kindness in his eyes. He polished his shoes, though no one would likely notice, and carried with him a pie he had baked himself. It wasn't perfect. Its crust was uneven, the apples sliced a little thick, but he thought maybe Sophie would smile at it. When he arrived, the house was already alive with noise. He stepped inside after a brief knock, greeted by the scent of roasted meat and herbs. Emma ushered him in quickly, a forced brightness in her tone. "Oh, Dad, you made it. Here, let me take that." She reached for the pie but set it aside too quickly, not even lifting the lid. The sound of laughter poured from the dining room where Mark and Olivia were already seated with Sophie between them. David followed Emma in. His eyes landed on the table. Every plate gleamed, every glass filled, the food steaming in the center. And once again his chair stood out, not because it was missing, but because it was too obviously there, placed almost as an afterthought at the far end, half a step away from the circle of conversation. He sat down quietly. The chatter continued around him, stories about Mark's work, Olivia's complaints about her boss, Emma's plans for an upcoming trip. Their voices crossed and overlapped, but none of them reached him. Even Sophie, who once clung to him with eager questions, now seemed coached to stay within the orbit of her parents. She glanced at him once, smiled faintly, then looked back at her plate. David served himself a spoonful of potatoes, a slice of roast. He chewed slowly, tasting little. The sound of forks and glasses surrounded him, but he might as well have been eating alone. "Dad," Emma said suddenly, as though remembering. "Everything okay? You're so quiet." David lifted his gaze, his eyes steady. "I'm fine, don't worry." It was all he said. He didn't explain the silence, didn't force himself into their stories. He had learned painfully that begging for space at a table only made the space smaller. When the plates were cleared and dessert brought out store-bought cake, not his pie, David placed his napkin gently on the table. He rose, thanked Emma for the meal, and reached for his coat. "So soon?" Emma asked, startled. "Yes," David replied softly. "It was a long day." He left before coffee was poured, before conversations turned to lighter jokes. His footsteps down the driveway were slow but certain. He did not look back. Inside, Sophie ran to the window. She pressed her small hand against the glass, watching her grandfather's figure retreat beneath the street lamps. "Why does Grandpa always leave early?" she asked. No one answered her. Out on the road, David drove home in silence. The pie sat on the passenger seat, untouched. He placed it carefully in his refrigerator when he got back, though he knew he would likely finish it alone in the coming days. For the first time, the thought flickered clearly in his mind. Perhaps it was better this way. Perhaps it was time to stop waiting for invitations that arrived too late or too cold. In the dim light of his kitchen, he whispered to the empty chair across from him, "I won't beg for a place anymore, Margaret." And for the first time his exit had not been reluctant but chosen. The week passed quietly. No phone calls came, no new invitations arrived. The pie in David's fridge was gone now, eaten in small slices over lonely breakfasts. One evening, while the wind rattled against the window panes, David found himself drawn to the old oak cabinet in his study. It had belonged to his father before him, a heavy piece of furniture that smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Inside, behind stacks of envelopes and faded tax forms, lay a leather-bound ledger. He hadn't opened it in years. Pulling it onto the desk, he brushed away a thin film of dust and flipped the cover. The pages inside were filled with careful handwriting, each line a record of decades past. Jobs he had taken, payments received, materials bought and sold. But tucked between those pages were also deeds, bank statements, and a folded will. David sat back, staring at the documents. The house he lived in, the land it rested on, the modest but steady savings he had accumulated, all of it quietly intact. He had built it not for himself, but for them, Emma, Mark, and Sophie. His whole life, every extra shift, every splinter pulled from his hands, every ache in his back had been for family. But now, as he looked at the neat columns of numbers and signatures, a different thought stirred in him. What if his sacrifices no longer mattered to the ones he had made them for? He remembered the empty chair, the canceled dinner, the excuses, the laughter that had carried on without him. And suddenly, the idea of handing over his life's work to people who treated him like an afterthought felt wrong, like building a house for strangers who'd lock the door behind him. He closed the ledger, sat in the silence, then opened it again. His pen hovered over a blank page. Slowly, he began to write. In the event of my passing, the house and land shall be entrusted to Sophie Harris, with provisions to ensure its upkeep until she reaches adulthood. The words flowed steadily, not with bitterness but with clarity. For Sophie, the one who still pressed her hand to the window, who still lit up at the sight of a simple wooden boat, he would leave something lasting. For her, he would preserve the love her parents had forgotten to show him. When he finished, he slipped the papers into a new folder, labeling it with a single word: legacy. David leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. He thought of Margaret then, her gentle smile, the way she always believed respect was the truest form of love. You were right, he whispered to the shadows. Love isn't just given, it's also remembered. Outside, the night deepened, stars hidden behind clouds. Inside, in the quiet glow of a single lamp, David Harris made his silent decision. The ledger, once a record of work, had become something greater, a record of justice waiting patiently in the dark. The following Monday morning, David woke earlier than usual. The sky outside was still pale, the kind of gray-blue that hints at dawn but refuses to commit. He brewed a pot of coffee, poured himself a cup, and sat at the kitchen table with the folder he had marked legacy. The decision had settled inside him like a stone at the bottom of a river, firm, unmoving, beyond second thoughts. He placed a call to an old friend, Robert Mendez, a lawyer who had handled simple matters for him years ago. Robert's voice, still strong though touched with age, greeted him warmly. David Harris, been too long, old friend. David smiled faintly. Robert, I need to put some things in order, quietly. There was no need to explain further. Men of their generation understood that tone. By the afternoon, David sat across from Robert in a small office lined with shelves of law books that looked untouched but smelled of authority. He handed over the folder, every page organized with carpenter's precision. I want everything transferred to my granddaughter Sophie, David said. The house, the land, my accounts. If she's too young, set it in trust until she's ready. No one else. Robert studied him carefully. You're certain this cuts out Emma and Mark completely? David nodded once. They've made their choices. This is mine. For a long while, the only sound was the scratching of Robert's pen. Each stroke made the decision more real, more permanent. When it was done, David signed where he was told. His hand trembled slightly, not from doubt but from the weight of closing a chapter he had carried for decades. As he drove home, the folder no longer felt heavy. It felt like release. That evening, his phone buzzed with a message from Emma. "Dad, sorry we've been so busy. We'll plan another dinner soon. Sophie keeps talking about that boat. She sleeps with it next to her bed." David read the words carefully. A part of him softened. At least Sophie still thought of him. But the rest of the message felt thin, the kind of courtesy typed quickly between errands. He set the phone down without replying. Instead, he walked into the shed, opened a fresh block of pine, and began carving another boat. His hands moved with steadiness, each stroke a meditation, each curl of wood falling like a prayer. He wasn't carving for Emma or Mark anymore. He wasn't even carving for recognition. He was carving for Sophie, for the future she would inherit, for the proof that her grandfather's love had been constant even when her parents had faltered. Late into the night, the shed light glowed. From the outside, neighbors might have thought David was just another old man passing the time. But inside, every chisel mark was a declaration. Every groove in the wood a line in the story he had chosen to write, quietly, without announcement, but irreversible. By the time he turned off the lamp, his decision was no longer a private thought scribbled in a ledger. It was action, signed and sealed, waiting to be discovered in its own time. David Harris was still the same man, gentle, steady, quiet. But now, beneath that silence, he held a truth sharp as a blade. He would not beg for his place in their lives. Instead, he would define it on his own terms. The leaves had turned gold and copper by the time Thanksgiving arrived. The town smelled of roasted turkeys and wood smoke, every porch decorated with pumpkins that sagged slightly in the November chill. Emma had invited David again. This time the invitation carried no excuses, no half-hearted tone. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was simply tradition. Either way, David came. He wore his best jacket, brushed his thinning hair, and carried a small tin of cranberry sauce he had made himself, Margaret's old recipe. He stepped into the house, greeted by warm air and the hum of conversation. The dining table gleamed as it always did on holidays. Platters of food, polished silver, glasses ready for toasts. Mark carved the turkey, Olivia passed the bread, Sophie darted around in excitement. For a moment, it almost felt like the family he remembered. Almost. When everyone was seated, Emma raised her glass. "To family," she said, her voice carrying more weight than usual. "We're grateful for all we have." Glasses clinked. Conversation resumed. And then, just as dessert was about to be served, there came a knock at the door. Emma frowned, rising to answer it. On the porch stood Robert Mendez, holding a sealed envelope. He nodded politely, handed it to her, and left without explanation. Emma returned to the table, puzzled. She opened the envelope and began to read. Her face paled. "What is it?" Mark asked. Emma's voice trembled as she continued aloud. This is Dad's will." The room fell silent. David sat calmly at the far end of the table, his eyes steady. He didn't interrupt as Emma read the words. The house, the land, the savings, all placed in trust for Sophie alone. None of it left to Emma or Mark. Sophie's eyes widened in confusion, her small voice breaking the silence. "Grandpa, does that mean it's all for me?" David finally spoke, his tone gentle but unyielding. "Yes, sweetheart, it's for you, because you still remember me, because you still see me." Emma's hands shook, the paper crinkling. "Dad, why would you do this?" He looked at her not with anger but with the quiet sadness of a man who had carried too much alone. "Because a seat at the table is not about food, Emma, it's about respect. And when respect is gone, family is only a word. No one spoke after that. The room felt heavier than any Thanksgiving past. David stood slowly, pushed in his chair, and picked up his coat. "Thank you for the meal," he said softly. "I'll let you finish the evening." He walked toward the door. Sophie jumped up, clutching his hand. "Grandpa, can I come over tomorrow? We can sail the boat in the pond." David smiled for the first time that night, bending to kiss her forehead. "Yes, darling, tomorrow." And then he left, his figure framed against the autumn night, steady, unbroken, carrying with him not bitterness but dignity. Inside, the family sat stunned, the letter still trembling in Emma's hands. Outside, David breathed in the cool November air, free at last from the hunger for a place at their table. Thank you, dear friends, for staying with us through this story. If it touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to Family Shadows for more tales of love, sacrifice, and the quiet justice that shapes families. Until next time, may you and your loved ones share respect at every table. We wish you good health, peace in your hearts, and happiness in your families.